Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of International E-Commerce Day. We are now live with Johann van Tonder, straight from Cape Town, South Africa. He's a great guy in this CRO space. I think there are a few experts which are really knowing what they are saying about CRO, and Johann is one of them because he has a huge experience in A/B testing and conversion rate optimizations. He's the chief operational officer at AWA Digital, which is a large agency, large conversion rate optimization agency from London. And Johann is there to dominate the world and to make it an international agency. So today he's gonna talk about prioritization. And as you know, prioritization is a very important thing in life and in the conversion rate optimization as well. So Johann, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Valentin. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining me. As Valentin says, we're going to be talking about prioritization, which I think is an area in CRO that is not talked about enough. I've seen many CRO programs not do well, even fail, and when we get called in to rescue it, then when you look at the detail, then often this is where it falls down. So I'm going to get straight into it, and I want to start by looking at a very interesting story out of Amazon. This, I'm sure you all know, the famous product recommendation engine that Amazon became famous for. Interesting story behind this, and I wonder how many of you know this. So the guy who came up with this idea was a junior software developer at Amazon, a guy called Greg Linden, and he was inspired by what he saw in the checkout line at his supermarket. You know, that trap where you end up before you get to pay and you're surrounded by all the stuff, you know, things that you absolutely don't want, but you're going to end up buying some of it anyway. And he was playing with the idea of what that could look like online. And he made a quick mock-up of an early version of this and shared it internally with his superiors. And to his surprise, not everyone was as excited about the idea as he was. And there was one guy in particular, senior VP of marketing, very influential role in Amazon, who was dead against it. He said that this idea, it would distract Amazon's customers and that Amazon wasn't ready for it. So Greg was ordered to abandon the idea. Now, tenacious software developer, he wasn't going to let this dude from marketing win without putting up a fight. So he built a prototype and he got it ready for testing. And well, of course, you know what happens next, because not only is it now synonymous with Amazon, but it's all over the web. And as Greg recounts the story on his blog, he concludes not only did it win this test, but the feature won by such a wide margin that not having it live was costing Amazon. So this story, I mean, it's a remarkable story, but it illustrates the value of having a system by which to evaluate ideas like this. You know, some consistent criteria that you can apply and inject some level of objectivity. When you first listen to the story, you might simply dismiss it as hippo nonsense. But when you scratch a little bit deeper, it's essentially about somebody's hunch with no evidence versus somebody's opinion. And that's where you need something like a triage framework, some predefined set of criteria that everyone has agreed on, this is important, and that you can apply consistently, the same set of criteria used every time to evaluate each idea. And it also evolves as you learn what works and what works better and what works less well. You know, you build on this. And you know, the easiest thing in CRO is coming up with a list like this of things to do. You put a few of us in a room for half an hour looking at a site, we'll walk away with a long list of ideas. I'm sure you've seen this movie before. The key thing is, where do you start? You know, what's test number one? How do you sequence it? How do you stack it up into a roadmap? Where are your quickest gains? And should you even be after your quickest gains? And there are a couple of realities that you're up against. So reality number one is that most A/B tests don't win. You'll find many different stats online. This is just one. But the fact is that most A/B tests in most programs don't win. Now, there are things you can do to make that slightly better by using, for example, a proven methodology. And in and of itself, this isn't even such a bad thing because you can learn from losing tests. We all know that you can You can take that insight and build on it. But that's reality number one. Reality number two is, of those tests that do win, most of them are quite modest wins. So this is from effective experiments, and they have the benefit of thousands of test data being stored in their system. And when they did an analysis on this, found that the vast majority are single-digit uplifts. So inherently, every test you run is an opportunity cost, because instead of running that test at that time, you could be running something else that gives you a better chance at winning and gives you a chance at getting a better win. So there's an opportunity cost that you've got to mitigate against, and this is where triage comes in. But triage is more than just ranking. If you do it well, will determine or improve the success of your overall testing program. So here are the key drivers, success drivers of a testing program: win rate, effect, which is your magnitude of uplift, and then your velocity, the number of tests you run. And if you do triage well, if you do prioritization well, then you'll improve the KPI, each of these KPIs. So triage essentially is about ROI. Fundamentally, triage is return on investment, which is the ratio between the cost of doing something versus the expected return of that something being done. And if you look at the frameworks, the triage frameworks, the prioritization frameworks, and we'll get into it now, you'll see that theme coming through. So let's look at the first one just to give you that idea. So this is Brian Eisenberg's framework, reasonably famous one, TIR framework. And there you'll see the cost and return, the two elements played off against each other. Time, how long will it take to execute? Importance, there's your return. By how much can we increase revenue or reduce costs? And the resources, your cost element. And the way this framework works is you assign a score in each of those areas out of 5, and then you multiply them. So the maximum score would be 125, 5 times 5 times 5. And that would be ranked at number 1. And then so you would, the list would go on. The lower the rank, the lower the score, the lower the rank. So it's a very straightforward, very simple system, and brings those two components of ROI together very well. And it's used by a lot of people, potentially even in this conference. The other one that's probably even more famous, arguably the most widely used framework in CRO is Chris Goward's PI framework. So let's go through that a little bit, and you'll see the same elements at play here. So what you do in this case is assess each idea in each of these 3 areas: potential, importance, and ease. So potential is how much improvement can be made in this particular area that's being tested. Importance is about reach, how valuable the traffic is in that area. We'll look into each of these in a moment. And then ease, which is the complexity of the test, so your cost coming in there. I often find there's a bit of confusion between potential and importance, so I'm going to look a little bit deeper into each of these. So this is the overall framework, the calculation, how it's put together. You've got the score out of 10 in each of these areas: potential, importance, and ease. And then you add it together and divide it by 3 to get the average. So as I said, I want to drill into each of these. Potential is your evidentiary basis. So this is where you look at your evidence. So analytics, for example, you might look at page value, exit rates, bounce rates, journey mapping. But you'll also look at your other data sources, and you'll triangulate these things. And this is where you see the opportunities and how they stack up, and you assess what the potential upside is in each of this. This is where you look at the evidence in order to determine that expected business impact. The next one, importance, is, as I said, about reach. So mainly traffic volume, how much traffic is on this page. And of course, that's important because we all know that the less traffic you have in an area, the more difficult it is to run tests in that area. So that's being reflected, but also traffic cost. So how much money are you spending on traffic in that particular area that's being investigated? And the more money you're spending to buy traffic to that page, that area of the site, the higher it will rank ultimately, because as you improve the performance of that area, you, by extension, are stretching that acquisition dollar of yours. And that brings us to ease, which is the last one. And Goward makes a distinction between technical ease and political ease. Technical ease, things like what level of CSS and JavaScript backend changes, advanced conditioning, that sort of thing. But also, your resources. So how many people are involved from a dev perspective, design, copywriting. And the more people involved, the more complex that becomes. You might look at things like restrictions, even reusability of code. Political ease, I think there's no better story that illustrates that than the Amazon one that I opened up with. An area that's often politically difficult is the homepage. We've often come up against it because it's so visible. Everyone has an interest in it, and it's looked at every day, and it carries brand tone and all that sort of things. So sometimes, often actually, that's politically not the easiest area of the site. But you look at each of these areas, you assign a score, and then your list evolves. The list we looked at earlier evolves into something like this. So now you've got that same list, but you've got 4 additional columns. Each of your potential importance and ease, you've got a score in each of those areas. And then the pi score in the last column. And that, the higher the score, the higher it will rank. So you'll do a sort by pi score, and that will determine your ranking. Now, this is a great system, and as I say, probably the most widely used system. And it's either this or the TIR that I just showed from Brian Eisenberg. Those are both good starting points. The one drawback with something like pi is that, in my mind, it gives too much weight to ease. So let me explain that a little bit. So you might have an idea, a test idea, that has reasonable potential, but because it scores low on the ease side of things, it won't rank highly. The converse is also true, and it's probably true more often, where you have a test of limited potential, but because it's easier to execute, it finds its way to the top of your list. And the worst case, and I've seen so many of these roadmaps, the worst case is where you have a roadmap that leans towards those tests. So you've got a list of tests at the top, test number 1 to 10, all of limited value, limited potential, but they sit at the top because, or a lot of them sit at the top because they're essentially easy to do. And that's, I think, is not a great place to be. So you need to think through that a little bit. And I think a good way to do that, to think through this, is to look at a matrix like this, where you plot complexity, cost, versus impact, return. And this is an interesting exercise because now you can look at, for example, let's look at top left, something of low complexity but high impact. That's a no-brainer. That's the kind of idea you want to jump all over and you want to tackle right away. Those are your quick gains. The problem with that is there are only a few of them, and you're going to deplete that list very quickly. So that's low complexity and high gain. No-brainer. The other no-brainer, potentially, is bottom right, if you think of it. High complexity, low impact. Why would you? It's going to cost you a lot. It's super complex. It's not going to deliver anything. You're going to avoid that. And this is one of the problems with the RATS approach. Have you heard of RATS? Random acts of testing, where you pick ideas from a list randomly. Chances are you'll be picking ideas that fit in this quadrant. It's a waste of time and a waste of money and a waste of resources. Now, this is where it becomes interesting, because what's left are 2 quadrants which, is the cause of a lot of debate. So let's start with the one bottom left, where you have low complexity and also low impact. So a lot of people will say, well, do it. This is the next area to pick from because it's low complexity. I'm not so sure about that, because low impact, that's where the opportunity cost comes in. You could be doing something, spending that time and money and effort, working on something that's going to deliver a better impact. So for me, unless there's a learning upside, so you're going to draw insight from this that will enable you to build on and find momentum in the project, I don't think it's worth doing. And the other way to approach it is to say, let's draw from this area for fillers. And what I mean by that is to build momentum, to increase velocity, or to keep velocity in your testing program. You can pick from this occasionally to make sure that you have that momentum. As you're busy preparing for bigger tests, as you have developers working on more complex tests, then maybe, you know, this is where you can draw to keep that momentum going. And that leaves us with the last column, which is also a very interesting one, because for me, that's the next go-to one after the obvious low complexity and high impact in block 1, top left. That's where I harvest ideas for, you know, the next set, because it's high impact, which is what you want. But there are ways, there are a few strategies, few things you can do to mitigate that, you know, to deal with that complexity which sits in that column. And there are two that I want to mention to you briefly. The one is to run pilot studies. So what this means is before you actually run the A/B test, you do some form of pilot study. It could be a survey, so where you test the potential response from your audience before you actually put it out to an A/B test. Somebody who did this recently was Spotify. Before they ran a big test, they ran a survey to get some data on how that might look, and that steered them in a direction. You could also do something like, and I've done this many times before, and it's a great way of approaching this, is do a lo-fi prototype in something like InVision, and then you do usability testing on it. And so at the very least, what it lets you do is rank those complex ideas, so you know which one to bet on first, because they're all complex. So and you might even be in a position where I've often been, that allows you, based on the feedback from that usability testing, to fine-tune your hypothesis, to adjust, to make tweaks, and you know, give yourself a better chance of success, of a win when you finally launch it. And then the other area that I'm a big proponent of is minimum viable experiments. So just test enough to launch with enough to test the hypothesis, to validate the hypothesis. I often see optimizers obsessing over minutia. And the question really is, how can you dial down complexity if it doesn't get in the way of validating the hypothesis, then drop it. So that's one way of doing it. And the other way, of still in the vein of minimum viable experiments, is taking a big concept, like a big test, and breaking it down into smaller parts. And essentially what you're doing then is you're taking that one massive test that sits in the top right quadrant, and you're moving it down into the bottom left quadrant. So you're making a far lower complexity test, but at the same time lower impact, but then you build on it. So it's a series of minimum viable experiments that build on each other, and gradually you build your way into that top right quadrant where you want to be. You know, you learn your way through them. Maybe you abandon halfway through, but then at least you haven't spent all that resources. You've done it in a much better way. So onto another system, which is lesser known in CRO. It's from the world of product management, and it's a different way of looking at this ROI equation. So you've got cost and value weighed up against each other. But what's different here, you'll see, is the scale. So you've got a defined scale. And what they do in this case is use the agile point system. And it's beyond the scope of this discussion to talk about exactly what the agile point system is. Many of you who have worked in Scrum and agile systems will know what that is. You can Google it, you'll find lots of information on it. But that's the way you assign the score to each of the ideas in each of these areas, cost and value. But you'll see the similarities with Pi and even with TAR, but this is where it ends, because instead of looking at it in a 2D way like this, just a flat table, what you do next is you plot this on a scatter plot. You've got your two axes, cost and each of these. Now, this in itself is of limited use, right? So I make this useful is now you draw a line, each of the ideas on the bottom left corner, and that looks like this. And now this starts becoming useful as the line on the far left, highest ranked idea, and then you work through the wheel, through this fan, and the next line represents the second ranked idea, and so on. What's interesting here, note that idea 2 and idea 4 are on the same line. They're in a tie for position number 2. If you compare that to the list, then idea 2 and number 4, you know, if you just look at this, you will have ranked idea 2 far higher than idea 4. But, you know, looking at it on the graph, you can see that actually they're in a tie. So it's a different way and a more robust way of plotting that out and looking at how it stacks up. So with a few minutes we have left, I want to talk a little bit about creating your own triage framework. And you might think, why would you want to create your own triage framework? There are so many frameworks. We've spoken about a few of them already. Use Pi, TRR, whatever. Why would you want to create your own? And if you ponder this question a little bit, would Greg Linden's idea, the Amazon product recommendation engine, would that idea have survived the Pi framework? If you think about it, weak evidentiary base, it's politically complex as it can be. It's not technically easy, algorithms and that sort of thing. So it might not have ranked very high in a system like Pi. So what you want to do is you want to determine, you want to consider what's relevant in your context, what's relevant for your business, the things on the left. We've spoken about all of that. Some of that might not even be relevant to you. Some of it will weigh higher than the others. It might be that you're in a lean environment, you really want to focus a lot on cost and less on potential, and that's your prerogative. The ideas on the right, things on the right, and that's by no means an exhaustive list. You know, you've got to consider, again, business objectives, what's important in your context. It may be that you want to emphasize something like stakeholder buy-in. So when the senior VP of marketing in your organization says, kill an idea, maybe that's something that has to be reflected in your program. I've worked with clients who've said that they value learning more than the actual revenue uplift because they want to build a customer knowledge base. You might want to, in terms of your culture, have a little bit more fun. So you want to inject that into the system. We'll look at an example of doing that. So, you know, you've got to sit with your team and your stakeholders and think about what's important for you, and then come up with a system that accounts for that, that reflects that. That's what Hotwire did. This is now quite a famous system, and you'll see how it works in a moment. So you've got the list of criteria, predetermined criteria on the left, and this is fluid. I mean, this is what's important in your organization. So in this example, the top line, what this company wants to do is they want to focus on the revenue as far as possible. So the question they ask is, can we use RPV, revenue per visitor, as a primary metric? And then you add a point if it's possible, and you subtract a point if it's not possible for this given test idea. And so you go through the list, and you know, your various criteria will differ, but the system is you add and subtract points depending on whether it satisfies that criteria or not. A similar system, maybe slightly easier, is where you have, in this case, I've got 5 criteria. You can have unlimited criteria on your spreadsheet. And so it's also a list of predefined criteria. And then you've got your ideas on the left in the rows. So each row is a different idea. And then depending on whether that idea satisfies a particular criterion or not, you will give it a plus or a minus, and a 0 if it doesn't make a difference. And you'll add it all up in the score column, and then that determines your rank. Similar to that, maybe slightly more complex, is the weighted scorecard, where again you've got the criteria in the top row, predetermined criteria in the same way that we've just spoken about. But in this case, each one has a weight assigned to it. And this will be influenced and agreed on by your stakeholders, management perhaps. And then for each idea, you assign a score out of 100 against each of those criteria. And this then determines your score, which then makes up the rank. And there are many, many different systems. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what's possible and how you can build this out. And so here's another approach, and that's the bucket system. And what this does, and it's usually used in combination with other systems, with some of these other ranking methods that we've spoken about. And in this case, it lets you find a good spread through various criteria. So let's say, for example, you've got different KPIs, conversion rate, AOV, and various others. This, by using the bucket system, you can make sure that you have tests at all time that talk to each of these KPIs. In this case, on this screen, we've got at any given time, there's a test in one of these areas on the site. So you have multiple tests running at the same time. You've got to be comfortable with that. And you've obviously got to do the necessary precautions to make sure that there's no cross-contamination and that sort of thing. But that's the fundamental principle here is for this business, it's important to make sure that there's something running in each stream. And then again, you'll have your specific ranking criteria within each of these buckets. And the last, another way of slicing it is user-driven, persona-driven. So especially when you're doing personalization, and this is maybe a good way of making sure that you've accounted for each of those segments. So again, many ways in which you can do it. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about this can also be fun. So here's one way of injecting fun into it is this notion of letting your team buy an idea. So how this works is as follows. It can be the team, the project team, the stakeholders, clients, doesn't matter. Anyone with an interest in the testing program. So you have your list of ideas, and each idea has a price tag. Now this price tag depends on certain criteria. So it could be the lower the pi score, the higher the price tag. It could simply be the more complex the test is, the higher the price tag. And then each member of the team gets a certain amount of money. Not too much, only enough to afford about, let's say, a third of all the ideas. And of course, as you pay for a more expensive idea, you have less money left for the other ideas. The interesting dynamic then that starts happening, firstly, as you buy an idea, you've got to justify why it is that you're willing to put money on that idea, even though it's monopoly or some other form of play money. You've got to justify that expense. But where it really gets interesting is where you run out of money and where there are ideas that are really expensive towards the bottom of the list and where people have to pool money. So now you've got to convince somebody else why this is such an important idea that they've got to contribute money to you so that you can afford this idea. So it stirs discussion and debate and a lot of thinking that doesn't happen under normal conditions. So that's a really interesting way of doing it. And so many ways in which you can do this, and it's now your turn. And I think my core message here is that you've got to have a system, any system. There are many. It doesn't have to be one of these that I've shown, but you've got to have some way, some consistent set of criteria that you've thought about, that you've agreed on, and that you can apply consistently to objectively evaluate all ideas. It's got to be focused on ROI. So return on investment, cost versus return, those are the two elements you probably want to bring into it. But you also want to align it with your business context. No two businesses are the same, we know this. And so there may be things that we haven't even spoken about that are important in your organization. You've got to reflect that in your system. And probably the most important thing is that the list of ideas is not what you should stress about. That's not what you should obsess over. It's about the process, both the process of generating those ideas and also then the process of triaging them, of prioritizing them, of deciding which idea you're going to tackle next, how they're going to rank, which ideas you're going to allow to bubble up to the top. And then I want to leave you with this recommendation. There's a lot more of what I spoke about today in the book that I'm the co-author of. And I'm excited to announce that the Publisher Kogan page has offered a 20% discount for people on this call. If you go to that URL, bit.ly/people, arrive on the publishers page, that code at the bottom of the page will unlock your discount. So if you feel like doing it, please make use of that. And that brings me to the end of
Johann, thanks a lot for sharing this. Unfortunately, you've been cut off for a few seconds. So if you can just repeat the offer that you are doing to our audience, it would be great.
Yeah, I think it's all there. So it's Kogan Page, the publisher of this book, where there's I think an entire chapter on prioritization, but a lot more. And they were kind enough to offer a 20% discount for this audience, and you go to that URL, you enter that code, and that will unlock it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot, Johann. Then we have a few questions for you. The first question, I think you've actually answered to this. It was, how do you prioritize not the ideas, but the criteria? So mainly what I'm understanding from Tao is that maybe he's asking if you are giving a different weight to certain criteria before prioritization.
Yeah, that's I understand the question. It's not about the ideas, it's about the criteria by which the ideas are evaluated. That is the product of lots of discussion and debate. And usually it involves stakeholders. So those stakeholders could be your management team, it could be the hippos, it could be clients if you're agency side. So it could be that and it also depends. It's the starting point there is understanding what the business objectives are, and flowing from that what the KPIs are. That will determine what even those potential criteria would be. And then in terms of ranking them, it's just, it's discussion and it's agreement, it's debate.
Okay. We also have another question from Sumanta. She's asking what's important to build a great user experience, the motivation of the user, the value proposition, the friction that the elements are presenting, or the elements that are presenting anxiety. So how to collectively bundle all of these factors to hit that sweet spot. So I think it's a rather relative question. So
yeah, that's a big question, and so let's try and relate that back to prioritization before maybe I'll answer it a little bit more broadly as well. So in terms of prioritization, again, this is each of these things that you mentioned. You can take a view in your organization about the relative importance of each of these. So you spoke about UX, you spoke about motivation, value proposition, friction, and a couple of other things. So you could say those are your criteria. So does this idea satisfy what you want to achieve in terms of value proposition? Then that would be a +1. If it doesn't, then it would be -1. And so you can go through the rest of them. A more broader answer, that's how it relates to prioritization, and that will be different depending on your context. It'll be different for every business. The broader question, if there is a broader question, these are all important things. Motivation, without motivation, nothing will happen. I urge you to look at, if you haven't yet, there's a scientist at the Stanford Persuasion Labs. I'm going to forget his name now, but BJ Fogg, Dr. BJ Fogg, he came up with the BJ Fogg framework that explains how important motivation is. Look at that. Without motivation, nothing will happen. So you need to understand that. The way you understand that is by doing a number of things. There are a whole list of research techniques you can use to explore motivation, interviews, and also quantitative things. But that's the starting point. Without that, nothing will happen. But it's not the only thing. A few other things have to fall in place as well. Value proposition, I can't stress the importance of value proposition, but I can do an entire talk on value proposition. here's the thing with value proposition is it's probably the most misunderstood and misinterpreted and misrepresented concept in CRO. In fact, I'm not saying that. The guy who came up with the term value proposition says that. A guy called Frank Lanning, who used to be a consultant at McKinsey in the 80s, came up with the term value proposition. And he recently said, he reads a lot of the stuff that people wrote about value proposition recently. He doesn't recognize any of it. It's not value proposition. So value proposition defined correctly and understood properly is fundamental. It is one of the key pieces to get right and it's one of the areas that has the biggest impact potentially on conversion rate, not only conversion rate, on business overall, but it needs to be understood correctly. And as I say, there's unfortunately a lot of rehashed hogwash about that on the blogosphere out there.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Johann. I don't think we have any other questions. So thanks a lot for joining us at International E-Commerce Day. I'm gonna show to our audience again the slide with from where they can get the book, and mainly, yeah, have a great day ahead in
Thank you.
in Cape Town over there.
Thanks.
See you next time, Johann. All the best.
Bye. Bye.